The other, and the possibility of transcendental intersubjectivity in Husserl and Stein. One of the delights of phenomenology is its refusal to promise more than it can deliver. In keeping, my topic in the following study, expressed more precisely than in the title, is a study of the transcendental necessary conditions for the possibility of intersubjectivity. So this is if we take Husserl's reduction to heart. If an intersubjectivity were to exist, certain conditions must be met. The title implies that both Stein and Husserl recognize the possibility of the intersubjectivity, although it may seem as if only Stein embraces its actual existence. Husserl and Stein agree that the possibility of transcendental intersubjectivity necessarily entails empathy, which they hold is the means for knowledge of another. Nevertheless, prior to Stein's analysis in her dissertation, The Problem of Empathy, Husserl used empathy to perform an important function in his systematic philosophy without a clear notion of the theory of empathy. When Stein suggested to him that she write on empathy, he welcomed her proposal. At his request, Stein devoted much attention to earlier theorists of empathy, especially Theodore Lipps and Max Scheler, before contrasting her own analysis with theirs. Husserl and Stein had different motivations for their interest in empathy. Her original and steadfast pursuit throughout her life was understanding persons. And whatever empathy may be, however it is theorized, there's wide agreement that what we call empathy refers to perceptions and actions which allow us to understand other persons as each another I, each one among others. I'll turn first to Stein. She began her higher education inspired by the question of the human person. She initially studied psychology, but soon moved on to study under Husserl, the founder of 20th century phenomenology. She became convinced that psychology was not comprehensive enough to provide a proper understanding of the person. Her analysis in The Problem of Empathy, which she wrote under Husserl, finds the person to be an entity composed of body, soul, and spirit. In a later work, Potency and Act, she more fully expands this definition so that the person becomes a self-sufficient spiritual subject. Because every I is something singular, she writes, the spiritual subject is an individual. In this post-conversion work, she certainly does not take the position that persons make themselves, or worse still, that others make them. Rather, each person is an individual, separate from everything else, its own entity. Even in the womb, the fetus's DNA is different from that of its mother or its twin. So this seems to us clearly an overstatement, and indeed it is. But Stein is interested, well, and Husserl as well, in establishing the person as a nexus of meaning making. Each person is an I, not an empty form that life is put into from without. Rather, its life comes from within, from itself. All persons share this triune structure that Plato first described in the Republic. He thought that a person is intellect, rationality, spirit, emotions, and body, desires. Stein likewise recognizes the body as a part of the human person, in addition to soul and spirit. That these three parts are distinguishable is shown by conflicts among them, as Plato taught us. On a small boat in the middle of the ocean, the thirsty body calls for water, while the intellect prohibits it, since salt water would harm the body. Or on a freeway, the eyes desire to see the bleeding accident victim, while the intellect says to them, "You'll regret it." The 19th century psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud uses a similar three-part structure to account for oppositions within the self. The human person seems not to be one piece, but only seeking to become a unity. Thus, persons can be more or less difficult to understand. Understanding the other usually or often does not require empathy, except in its intense, intricate depths. In most circumstances, sympathy for others in their basic needs follows along the requirements for the species. News about violent storms elsewhere on the planet causes people to donate food, water, and clothing without regard for knowing the personalities or the biographies. Although journalists and social scientists use empathy properly, sympathy serves as sufficient motivation for wanting to help. In other words, with feeling for others in difficult circumstances, such as fires and floods, but not necessarily or desirably intimacy with any particular other. Intimacy with a particular other is the task of empathy. Stein grounds her analysis of the Constitution, the making of meaning of a person, with a clear description of where an individual begins. A pure I, the otherwise indescribable, qualityless subject of experience. This is comparable to Husserl's anonymously functioning pre-ego. That I serves as the origin of all the I to be's awareness and identity. Here Stein takes issue with Theodore Lipps and many philosophers who follow his tack. She says that the individual does not first become an individual in contrast with you and he. The individual is itself and no other. This individual, pure I, provides grounds for all its experiences, be they conscious or not. Although the I is brought into relief in contrast with another, the I is first indistinguishable. The other is first indistinguishable from the I on the most basic level of consciousness. All is part of the I. This very primal preliminary I. And this is an insight that Husserl and Stein share too. The question is, how do I know the other? Why not just another part of me? The experience of the other is given differently from the way the self is given to itself. And the way the self is given to itself is in felt presence. I feel like I need to sneeze, or I'm aware of myself in a way that I can't be aware of the other. And this is partly a developmental thing. Only real otherness displays the pure I in its uniqueness. And again, this is primal. Its givenness to the I differs from the self-presence in which an I experiences itself. It is given to me in another way than I. Therefore, it is you. Husserl delivers this insight when he describes pairing, forming one unity with an ego and another, pairing, as having four dimensions in this meaning. But for each I, only three are possible to bring to presence. And what's left over? Well, that's you. That's the other. That's the stuff I don't live. Mere presence or absence provides, the I claims immediate presence for itself, whereas the other can only give itself mediately through its body or the bodies of words. Mere presence or absence provides little insight into the unrepeatability of each I or you, however. Juxtaposition for an experience, empty otherness fails to give an I intuition into an other. Empathy provides the means for recognize the other as she lives a life of valuing. Stein's interest in empathy was personalistic, not primarily epistemological, as was Husserl's. Her questions had to do with how it was possible to experience what another was feeling through empathy. Empathy provides a cognitive dimension when an I objectifies its experience of another's emotional state. In her sketch of the essence of empathy, Stein identifies three different moments, and these would be the initial perceptual grasp of the other, the sharing of the other's feeling in my body, but it's not generated by my circumstances. And then the third moment is the objectification. She gives the example of a sad man. He looks sad, and then I empathize with him, and I, in my feelings, feel his sadness, and then I come out of it and say that guy's sad. Okay. Now I'm going to turn to Husserl. Although both Stein and Husserl recognize a cognitive dimension to empathy, for Stein, empathy was primarily means to know persons, while for Husserl, an account of the possibility of empathy was essential to solve a methodological problem, to which we now turn. Husserl's systematic phenomenology depends on knowledge of other persons' experiences in order to Husserl's interest in empathy was systematic and methodological rather than personalistic. In his author's preface to the English edition of the first volume of his ideas, translated by Boyce Gibson, I think it's 1931 or something, it's an old. Uh, Husserl sketched an incomplete map of his systematic phenomenology. Although he specified an important role for the other within his systematic philosophy, he neglected to account for how consciousness can know that which is other than itself while remaining within itself. Wouldn't one subjective consciousness necessarily absorb another consciousness into its own, as put some more pepper in and it flavors all the stew? Wouldn't consciousness just... Husserl, how it is possible for consciousness to know that which is other than itself is seemingly unanswerable until the Cartesian meditations. Husserl specifies that the world, qua world, which my conscious experience delivers to me, is a cultural and historical world. The I dwells in a world that it shares with other consciousnesses, which the infant is born into, including grandparents, siblings, aunts, cousins, later co-workers, other students, friends. This is the world we take for granted in our ordinary living. But so Husserl begins here by describing the world, he calls it, in the natural attitude. And then he asks us to suspend belief in the existence of this world. And this would be on the order of a thought. This is the infamous phenomenological reduction. Why? Well, Husserl took consciousness to be the starting point of rigorous philosophy, as did St. Augustine, Descartes, and Kant, as well as many others. Self-experience must be indubitable, although the objects which an I experiences might not exist or exist as ideal objects, misapprehensions, hallucinations, or fantasies. Nevertheless, the I has its experiences, whether or not their phenomenological correlates exist. This indubitable starting point costs Husserl grounding for objective reality, subjecting his philosophy to the charge of subjective relativism, a skepticism incompatible with his aim for a science of philosophy. Well, how can strict consciousness justify a world that's not its own, that is not only its own? How can consciousness escape transcendental solipsism? What grounds does Husserl have available for the claim of an objective world? If all the I can know is its own consciousness, Husserl opens his philosophy up to the challenge of transcendental solipsism, and phenomenology, Husserlian phenomenology, becomes a pernicious subjectivity without grounds for objectivity in the strong sense, as independent of consciousness. Yet it is this sense of the world, as autonomous to any particular ego, to which Husserl seeks to return, understanding it in the consciousness which bestows its meanings. Stein rejects this difficulty while adhering to the necessity that the I is absolute. She writes, I can perceive something. It may later turn out that what I thought I perceived does not exist. However, it is not conceivable that my subsequent experience will show that I did not exist, nor that the consciousness of my existence will turn out to be a deception. In this passage, Stein clearly espouses the transcendental starting point. She holds that we find monads in this world, seemingly echoing Husserl in the fifth of the Cartesian Meditations, in his denial that an I can create others who shall exist for it, and I can only discover others, else they're part of the I, not other than it. My fantasy, to this ambiguity, Stein finds other monads, while for Husserl, the difficult task is to constitute others. Stein makes a single move. The monadic other presents itself, while the task Husserl undertakes requires the constitution of an other as a bodily object, and then the constitution of the other as a bodily object, independent and in the world. Now, it is nevertheless the second one. So the first one is, we might think of primary sensations and whatnot, but put these together and it becomes an object. Now, this object I take to be independent of me, but it isn't unless it's recognized by the other. So I have the sphere of my dreams and hallucinations and fantasy, and I have this other sphere of the real world, and this real world takes the other to confirm it. If it's just me, I can just be like Descartes in his oven. I can think any old thing I want. No, it needs confirmation with others who can undergo the phenomenological method and see the map that's been laid out. So, for Husserl, otherness is he called universal superaddition of sense to my primordial world, my first vague fleeting experiences, whereby the latter becomes the appearance of a determinate objective world as the identical world for everyone, myself included. The intrinsically first other, the first non-ego, is the other ego. And the other ego makes constitutionally possible a new infinite domain of what is other, an objective nature, and a whole objective world to which all other egos and I myself belong. In order to account for the ordinary experience of world and the natural attitude as a constitutive achievement, the possibility of experience of the other must be shown. On the other hand, for Stein, the possibility of others in their givenness to perception. So her task is we knew this, explaining empathy. She already has the other person, but then the question is, well, who is this guy? Husserl has to first constitute the other's body as an object, and then after he constitutes the other's body as an object, he can use that object to constitute the other as animate organism. So he's got a lot of work, and she's done with that. She's moving on. The task of accounting for others is much more exacting for Husserl. To know another is to know his inner life, and that's the function of empathy. Since the other's lived life resists direct apprehension, Husserl's transcendental phenomenological method requires an account of how it is possible to know these others who guarantee a shared world. So Husserl can't say others guarantee the world unless he also answers the question, well, how do I know another? So that's how we got to this place. Huh? Even if an eye sees a blue sky, Husserl's transcendental idealism prevents him from the ready assumption, which Stein makes, that the sight of the sky necessarily entails that such a sky exists. According to Husserl, others who share an eye's perception guarantee that the perception captures the state of affairs, an experience that cannot in principle be verified by other consciousnesses. One which is mine alone is more likely to be my dream or my hallucination rather than an object in this strong sense existing in a common world. The problem becomes how an I can know what another is thinking or perceiving or believing or feeling. The I can experience the other as an object occupying space and time, but the I cannot experience another's inner life directly. That's what makes us I and other. Indeed, for Husserl and Stein as well, this impossibility ensures that an I and its others is separate. So although an I can be aware of another's toothache, seeing it in another's grimaces and swollen cheek and listening to his complaints, and I cannot directly share another's experience of his toothache. And I can only feel another's feelings in the I's own body, as not originating in itself, but in another's lived life. In analytic philosophy, the problem, they call it, of other minds amuses and tantalizes, but need not be solved. Unlike in Husserlian phenomenology, nothing much depends on its solution. In a philosophy of common sense experience discloses the world. Oops. I'm sorry. These are not my phone. Okay. In lieu of this, this is a question that I'm not even going to take up, but I think it's an interesting one. By real world, Husserl means a shared world that is not mine alone. Now, the question that I'm not going to talk about because it's is the question of whether an intersubjective world can substitute for the meaning independently existing world. In Husserl's system, for a world to be more than mine, the I must be able to share experiences with others. In order to be able to account for our ordinary experiences, including lies and cons, inner lives of others must be opaque to an I, difficult to detect, and impossible to experience directly. If we reflect that any natural world is a cultural construction in a historical setting, we see that worlds may be shaped in numerous, though not infinite ways. These shapings typically share constituting reality as external to and independent of consciousness. But such judgments may not be justifiable. Husserl's, as we've seen, philosophy demands an account of empathy, since the recognition of shared experience grounds objectivity in the strong sense. I know that the world that we both see and hear and touch is in the intersubjective world, is the real world. Husserl and Stein held that empathy can produce sophisticated cognitive achievements which ensure that an I can possess objective knowledge concerning another's inner life. Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, with its starting point in consciousness rather than in independently existing objects, understands objects first as meanings, with an intention executed in acts and resulting in the correlates of the acts. Stein, on the other hand, insists that a subject meets real objects, a position of transcendental realism. The master, however, maintains a transcendental idealism, seemingly. Nevertheless, neither Stein's realism nor Husserl's idealism. Patently, if consciousness has meanings, the meanings consciousness includes cannot be independent of it. This is a statement of Husserl's basic doctrine of intentionality. Consciousness is consciousness of a noema, of an action that it intends through any number of acts: perceiving, hoping, believing, throwing, shopping, worrying, loving. Consciousness, however, seems to be ineluctably subjective, with all the epistemological perils that subjectivism entails, especially the charge of transcendental solipsism. Husserl's solution to this difficulty, which all transcendental philosophies face, is a transcendental idealism that accounts for consciousness of others to verify common experiences of a shared world. It then becomes essential for Husserl to account for the ability of constituting alter egos, the concern of the fifth of a Cartesian meditation. And he says that the fifth meditation completely collapses the solipsistic objection. His guiding question can be formulated as: how can a single unitary stream of consciousness constitute that which is other than itself? When in other's place remains the I, we see that projection cannot lead to knowledge of others, only to further iterations of the I. Walking in another's shoes usually implies a misfit, or perhaps, as was the case of Cinderella's stepsisters, an impossibility. What it feels like to walk in the other's place as the other requires the knowledge of the other that we're seeking. For an I to be in an other's circumstance cannot ensure that the first I shares the other's reactions to the circumstance. Persons have various histories, tastes, talents, most adults and children express contrary reactions to a snowstorm, for instance. And I and another have different favorite desserts, vacation spots, sports. Switching places does not suffice to obliterate differences between an I and another, or to provide any insight into the other. Empathy, although introduced and enhanced by outer perception, cannot be identified with outer perception. The correlates of outer perception and inner feeling, then we readily acknowledge that another's gestures or actions may feign emotions that do not legitimately spring from his feelings, but rather amount to a ruse in order to profit from the deception. Used car salesman spring to mind. And I's primordial experiences, including sensations given in outer perception, may lead it towards acts of empathy with another's primordial experience. The implication here is that only empathy can deliver knowledge of the others he's given to himself. By the same token, analogies that an I makes with its own previous experience presents only suggestions which require confirmations. Maybe a quite different relationship with a parent entails that my own experience of the death of a parent does not necessarily suggest to me knowledge of the other's feelings. Stein specifies the results of an analogizing must be verified. The other can easily be confiscated so that it becomes affiliated with the original I. If so, it cannot provide more than the I's own assurance about objects in a world which it doesn't share with others. Strong objectivity remains elusive until the constitution of the other is shown. Well, I'm running out of time. Stein says that I'm sorry, I couldn't.
How close are you to finishing? We're we're running into limits on our schedule today, and we have a little less than 5 minutes for discussion. If you could conclude, maybe we could take a question or some comments.
I'll see if my conclusion's helpful here. No, I don't think so. So the my basic idea here is that for Stein, the problem is that the others is immediately apparent as part of perception. This is intimated in empathy, but spelled out in potency and act. And for Husserl, the bodily object, the other, has to be shown as constitutive achievement. That's what all that was about. Thank you.